There is a shift that occurs inside the body after 60, and most people never sense it happening. The very medication you have been taking for years, the one your system handled without any difficulty, can begin to behave differently. Not because the drug changed, because you did. And in certain cases, that difference is not minor. It can be the line between protection and exposure, between stability and a slow, invisible accumulation of risk, leading towards something far more serious, a heart attack or a stroke. What makes this particularly dangerous is that nothing announces itself at the beginning. No warning, no pain, no clear signal, just a quiet internal shift. And today, we are going to examine 5 specific categories of medication that, after the age of 60, have been connected to an elevated risk of cardiovascular events, particularly when certain conditions are present, or when they are taken exactly as they were years ago without any reassessment. But here's the part that matters most. This is not about generating fear. This is about genuine understanding, about knowing what is actually happening inside your body so you can make informed decisions going forward. My name is DR.Michonne. I am a physician, and on this channel I translate complex medical topics into clear, practical explanations so you can better understand what may be unfolding inside your body and what actually makes a meaningful difference over time. If you find this kind of content valuable, you are welcome to subscribe, but more importantly, stay with me through this entire conversation, because one of the medications we are going to discuss is taken every single day by millions of people and almost never questioned. To understand why these risks increase after 60, you have to begin with something most people are never told. Your body no longer processes medications the way it once did. As we age, several key systems begin to decelerate. The liver, which is responsible for metabolizing many drugs, becomes less efficient. The kidneys, which filter waste and excess substances from the bloodstream, lose a portion of their filtering capacity. That means drugs linger in your system longer, sometimes considerably longer than anticipated. And when that happens, even a standard dose can begin functioning like a higher one over time. But that is only part of the picture. There is also a transformation in how your blood vessels respond. Your arteries lose flexibility. The inner lining of your vessels becomes more reactive to stress. Circulation patterns shift, and the delicate equilibrium between clotting and bleeding becomes more precarious. So when a medication touches any one of these systems, its effect can be amplified in ways that were not present a decade earlier. This is where people are frequently misled, because the medication itself is not necessarily the problem. It may have been entirely appropriate when first prescribed. It may still be useful today, but the context has changed. And in medicine, perhaps more than in any other field, context is everything. The same drug can be genuinely helpful in one situation and quietly hazardous in another. The same dose can be appropriate at 50 and excessive at 70. And yet in real life, prescriptions are often renewed for years without detailed reassessment. Not from negligence, but because these changes happen gradually and silently in the background of daily life. Here is where it becomes more consequential. After 60, the baseline risk of cardiovascular events, heart attacks, strokes, rises naturally. That is established. But when certain medications are layered on top of that elevated baseline, particularly without adjustment, they can push that risk higher, sometimes modestly, sometimes significantly, and often without any noticeable symptoms until something has already happened. That is precisely why this conversation matters. We are not simply talking about medications in the abstract. We are talking about how your body is interacting with them right now, at this specific stage of life, and what you can actually do about it. One essential point before we begin. Nothing we are about to discuss is a signal to stop any medication on your own. That is not the objective here. The objective is awareness, because when you understand how something functions, you ask sharper questions, you engage in more productive conversations with your care team, and you stop running on autopilot with something that may quietly need to be reconsidered. The first medication category is one people reach for constantly, often daily, for years, sometimes for decades, and rarely question. It is the group of drugs known as non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, or NSAIDs. This includes ibuprofen, naproxen, and certain prescription-strength anti-inflammatory agents. They are used broadly for joint pain, back pain, arthritis, and general inflammation. For many people, they represent a simple, immediate solution. You take one, the discomfort fades, and you continue with your day. But inside the body, something else is unfolding simultaneously. NSAIDs operate by blocking specific enzymes involved in the inflammatory process. That is what produces the pain relief. But those same enzymes also serve a protective function for your blood vessels and play a role in maintaining healthy blood flow. After 60, your vessels are already less pliable and their inner lining more sensitive to physiological stress. When NSAIDs interfere with that protective mechanism, the result can be a subtle constriction of blood vessels, a tightening that elevates blood pressure, often without any immediate sensation. Gradually, quietly, but persistently. At the same time, NSAIDs can disrupt how the kidneys regulate fluid balance, causing the body to hold on to more sodium and water, which places additional demand on the heart. Now, two things are occurring simultaneously: rising blood pressure and increasing fluid load. For a cardiovascular system that is already working harder after 60, that combination is not trivial. Multiple large-scale studies have demonstrated that prolonged or frequent NSAID use is associated with a meaningfully higher risk of heart attack and stroke, particularly in older adults or those who already carry cardiovascular risk factors. The relief arrives immediately. The damage accumulates slowly. You do not feel your blood pressure climbing in real time. You do not perceive the added strain on your arterial walls day after day, but over time, it compounds. The point here is not that NSAIDs are harmful by definition. It is that they require conscious use, short-term, occasional, monitored. Daily, long-term use after 60 without periodic reassessment is where the risk begins to tip. The second category is even more understated and even more underestimated. This is the class of drugs known as proton pump inhibitors, or PPIs. These include medications like omeprazole, esomeprazole, and similar acid-suppressing agents. They are routinely prescribed for acid reflux, heartburn, and stomach protection, particularly in people taking other medications that may irritate the digestive lining. On the surface, they appear entirely benign. They reduce acid, ease discomfort, protect the stomach. But this is where the less obvious effects begin. Stomach acid is not simply an inconvenience. It plays an active role in absorbing critical nutrients, particularly magnesium, calcium, and vitamin B12. Over time, long-term PPI use can gradually reduce the absorption of each of these. And that may not seem directly connected to cardiovascular risk, but it is. Magnesium is central to heart rhythm stability. Insufficient magnesium can raise the risk of irregular cardiac rhythms. Calcium balance influences vascular function. Vitamin B12 is involved in maintaining healthy blood vessels and the integrity of the nervous system. When these levels erode over time, the cardiovascular system becomes progressively more vulnerable. Beyond that, certain research has suggested that extended PPI use may impair the function of the endothelium, the inner lining of blood vessels that governs blood flow, clotting regulation, and vessel relaxation. When that lining is compromised, the risk of vascular events increases. None of this happens overnight. It accumulates slowly, without clear symptoms. And here is where the pattern becomes problematic. Many people are started on a PPI for a short-term issue and simply continue taking it for years without anyone revisiting whether it is still necessary. Because nothing seems wrong. Because it was prescribed. Because it has become part of the routine. But the longer it continues without review, the more the underlying effects begin to matter. And sometimes the solution is not stopping the medication. It is reassessing the duration, reconsidering the dose, or exploring whether an alternative approach is more appropriate. But that only happens when the question is raised. The third category is where the effects shift from subtle to something more directly significant, because these medications do not merely influence blood pressure or deplete nutrients. They interact with how your cardiovascular system behaves under stress. This category is benzodiazepines, medications used for sleep, anxiety, and calming the nervous system. Examples include diazepam, lorazepam, and similar agents. They are effective. They reduce anxiety quickly. They can facilitate sleep. And for many people, particularly later in life, they feel like an essential form of support. But here is what is happening beneath the surface. Benzodiazepines work on the central nervous system by slowing neural activity, producing that calming effect. But they also decelerate other systems throughout the body, including breathing, reaction time, and physical coordination. You might wonder, how does that connect to heart attack or stroke risk? This is where the mechanism becomes important. As we age, the body grows more sensitive to these medications. They remain in the system longer. They accumulate more readily. Their sedative effect intensifies even at the same dose. Over time, this can lead to reduced physical activity, less movement, more time spent stationary, and that matters considerably more than most people recognize. Circulation depends on movement. When movement decreases, blood flow becomes less efficient, the likelihood of clot formation rises, and oxygen delivery to tissues diminishes. But there is another dimension. Benzodiazepines can alter breathing during sleep, potentially contributing to shallow respiration or worsening existing sleep-related breathing disorders like sleep apnea. When oxygen levels decline repeatedly during the night, even modestly, it places additional strain on the heart. Now you have a combination of reduced circulation, lower oxygen saturation, and heightened vulnerability in an aging cardiovascular system. It does not feel dramatic. It feels like fatigue, like slower mornings, like the ordinary experience of getting older. But underneath, the system is under considerably more stress than it should be. The fourth category is where complexity deepens, not necessarily because of what the drug does in isolation, but because of how it interacts with everything else already in the picture. This category includes certain decongestants and stimulant-type medications, specifically those containing pseudoephedrine, found in various combination cold and sinus products. These are accessible over the counter, which lends them an air of harmlessness, but their mechanism tells a different story. Decongestants work by constricting blood vessels. That contraction is what reduces nasal swelling and relieves congestion. But that effect is not contained to the nasal passages. It extends to blood vessels throughout the entire body, including those serving the heart. When vessels constrict systemically, blood pressure rises, heart rate can increase, and the heart must work harder to drive blood through a tighter network. In a younger body with responsive, elastic arteries, this effect is generally tolerated. After 60, with vessels already less flexible, that added constriction can become significant, particularly in someone already managing elevated blood pressure or taking other cardiovascular medications. And this is where combinations become genuinely dangerous. Most people are not taking a single medication. They are managing several simultaneously. A blood pressure drug, a pain reliever, something for sleep, and then during cold or allergy season, a decongestant is introduced on top of everything else. Individually, each element may seem manageable. Together, they begin to interact. One raises pressure, another disrupts fluid balance, another slows the system, and the body must compensate for all of it at once. People are often caught off guard because the triggering event, the moment something goes wrong, appears sudden. But the accumulation has been building quietly for a long time. That is what makes these situations so disorienting. It feels like it came from nowhere. In reality, it was a gradual compounding of cardiovascular stress. The fifth category is the one that tends to generate the most surprise, not because it is obscure, not because it is infrequently used, but because it is everywhere, taken daily, trusted completely, and almost never questioned. The fifth medication is low-dose aspirin. For years, a small daily aspirin, commonly referred to as baby aspirin, was broadly recommended as a straightforward preventive measure against heart attacks and strokes, operating by reducing platelet aggregation and thereby inhibiting clot formation. And in certain clearly defined situations, that remains true. For individuals who have already experienced a heart attack or stroke, or who carry specific high-risk cardiovascular profiles, aspirin can still play a meaningful protective role. But here is where the landscape has shifted. More recent research has demonstrated that for many adults over 60 who have not previously had a cardiovascular event, the routine daily use of aspirin may not provide the protective benefit once assumed, and in some cases may actually introduce additional risk. Here is the mechanism. Aspirin reduces the capacity of platelets to adhere to one another. That inhibits clot formation within arteries. But clotting is not purely a threat. It is also a protective biological response your body relies on to stop bleeding when vessel walls are damaged. After 60, blood vessels become more fragile, the digestive lining grows more sensitive, and the balance between clotting and bleeding becomes more delicate. When aspirin suppresses clotting in this context, it can elevate the risk of internal bleeding, particularly in the stomach or the brain. There are two primary forms of stroke, one caused by a clot obstructing blood flow, and one caused by bleeding within the brain. Aspirin can reduce the risk of the first type while increasing the risk of the second. And after 60, without a clear personal history of cardiovascular events, that balance can shift in a direction where bleeding risk begins to outweigh protective benefit. This is precisely what updated clinical guidelines have begun to reflect. Many people started taking aspirin years ago based on older recommendations and simply continued. No change, no reassessment, because it felt like a safe, sensible preventive habit. But medicine evolves. What was once standard practice is not always the optimal approach today. Here is the unifying thread running through all 5 of these categories. Each medication has genuine value. Each was developed for a real purpose, but each carries a threshold, a point at which the balance can shift, and that threshold is not fixed. It moves with age. It moves with changes in your physiology. It moves with other medications, with lifestyle, with evolving underlying conditions. And that is precisely why awareness is the most powerful tool available to you. Because awareness leads to better questions, and better questions lead to better outcomes. Here are a few concrete steps that actually make a difference. First, review your medications regularly, not only when something goes wrong, but proactively. At your next appointment, ask your physician or pharmacist, is everything I am currently taking still appropriate for me at this stage? That single question changes the nature of the conversation. It shifts the focus from adding to evaluating, from reacting to optimizing. Second, pay attention to combinations. Many of the risks we discussed do not arise from a single drug, but from how multiple drugs interact with one another. Over-the-counter medications count. Occasional use counts. Everything entering your system is part of the equation. Third, notice the subtle signals your body is already sending. Not dramatic symptoms, small, consistent ones. Fatigue that builds faster than it used to. Lightheadedness when rising from a seated position. Shortness of breath during activities that previously felt effortless. Gradual changes in sleep quality or blood pressure readings. These are often early indicators that something in the system needs attention. And finally, recognize that your body is not static. What was appropriate and well-tolerated 10 years ago may not be optimal today. That is not a failure. It is simply the nature of how the body evolves, and understanding that is not a reason for alarm, but for alignment. The difference between reacting to a cardiovascular event and preventing one often comes down to small, informed adjustments made early. Not one dramatic intervention, a series of measured, intelligent decisions that keep the system in balance over time. And you have more influence over that process than you may realize. If this conversation has clarified something for you, or prompted you to look at your daily routine differently, consider sharing it with someone you know who is managing medications after 60. Because sometimes the most consequential changes begin with a single realization that what has worked before deserves to be looked at again. I am Dr. Michonne. Your health is not static, and neither should your approach to protecting it be.